The bullets came in waves, each burst of automatic gunfire chipping away at the concrete barrier that was all that stood between Riley Harper and 20 Taliban fighters who had her completely surrounded. Her M4 carbine felt impossibly heavy. In her hands, the metal slick with sweat and desert dust. Through the haze of smoke and chaos, she could hear them closing in, their voices growing louder with each passing second. The math was simple and terrifying. 1 rifle, 1 soldier, 20 enemies, and nowhere to run. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Just 12 hours earlier, her own squad had written her off as too gentle for real combat. They'd mocked her quiet demeanor, her habit of reading Wordsworth during downtime, the way she'd flinch slightly at the sound of mortar in the distance. "Harper's got no killer instinct," they'd whispered behind her back. "She'd crack under pressure." Now pinned down in a bombed-out compound in Kandahar Valley, with the lives of 6 wounded soldiers depending entirely on her ability to hold this position, Riley was about to prove just how wrong they'd been. The morning had started like any other at Camp Ironwood, the forward operating base that served as home to Alpha Company's 3rd Platoon. The Afghan sun was already blazing by 6 a.m., turning the dust-covered compound into an oven that would only get hotter as the day progressed. Riley Harper sat cross-legged on her cot, a worn paperback copy of Leaves of Grass open in her lap, her lips moving silently as she read Whitman's verses about the beauty found in ordinary moments. Around her, the barracks buzzed with the usual pre-mission activity, soldiers checking weapons, adjusting gear, and engaging in the kind of crude banter that served as armor against the fear that lived in everyone's chest. "Jesus, Harper, you reading poetry again?" The voice belonged to Corporal Jake Morrison, a thick-set man from Texas whose idea of literature peaked at sports magazines. He stood over her bunk, hands on his hips, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. "We're about to head into Taliban country, and you're worried about flowers and feelings?" Riley looked up from her book, her green eyes calm and untroubled. At 24, she had the kind of face that belonged in a coffee shop or a college classroom rather than a war zone. With soft features and auburn hair that she kept pulled back in a regulation bun. There was something almost ethereal about her presence, a quietness that seemed to create its own pocket of peace in the chaos of military life. "It's actually about the interconnectedness of all living things," she said gently, closing the book and placing it carefully in her footlocker. Whitman believed that understanding beauty made us more human, not less capable. Morrison snorted, the sound echoing off the metal walls of the barracks. "Yeah, well, being human ain't gonna help. You and some Taliban fighter is trying to put a bullet in your head. This ain't philosophy class, sweetheart. This is war." He turned to address the other soldiers who had gathered around, drawn by the prospect of entertainment at Riley's expense. "I'm telling you guys, we shouldn't have women in combat units, especially ones who think war is some kind of poetry slam." The comment drew chuckles from several of the younger soldiers, though Riley noticed that some of the veterans remained silent, their faces thoughtful. Sergeant Marcus Webb, a grizzled 20-year man who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Morrison, why don't you worry about your own gear instead of what Harper's reading? Last patrol, you forgot to pack extra batteries for your radio. That's the kind of mistake that gets people killed, not reading books." But Morrison was on a roll now, energized by his audience. "Come on, Sarge. You can't tell me you're comfortable with Librarian Barbie here watching your 6. Look at her." He gestured toward Riley, who was methodically checking her equipment with the same careful attention she gave to everything else. "She probably cries watching Disney movies. You think she's gonna be able to pull the trigger when it matters? You think she's got what it takes to kill another human being?" Private Danny Chun, barely 19 and eager to fit in with the older soldiers, chimed in. "I heard she's never been in a real firefight." Just convoy escorts and checkpoint duty. This is gonna be her first time in the shit, and we're supposed to trust our lives to someone who's never proven herself." The conversation was taking on a familiar rhythm, one that Riley had endured countless times since arriving at Camp Ironwood 3 months ago. Her fellow soldiers saw her quiet nature, her love of literature, her tendency to avoid the crude humor that dominated barracks life, and they interpreted these traits as weakness. They didn't know about the shooting competitions she'd won back in Colorado, the countless hours she'd spent at the range perfecting her marksmanship. They didn't know about her younger brother Tommy, who died in this same valley 2 years earlier, or the promise she'd made at his graveside to honor his memory by serving with the same courage he'd shown. Captain Derek Stone entered the barracks, his presence immediately commanding attention. A career soldier with 15 years of service, Stone had the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much combat and carried too much responsibility. His eyes swept the room, taking in the cluster of soldiers around Riley's bunk and the tension in the air. "All right, people, listen up. We've got a mission briefing in 10 minutes. I want everyone geared up and ready to move by 0800. As the soldiers began to disperse, Stone approached Riley's bunk. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "Harper, you doing okay? I heard some chatter." Riley finished securing her body armor and looked up at him. "I'm fine, Captain. Just the usual concerns about the new girl." There was no bitterness in her voice, no complaint or self-pity. She'd learned long ago that winning respect in the military wasn't about demanding it. It was about earning it through actions. Stone studied her face for a moment. "Today's mission is going to be challenging. We're doing a joint patrol with Afghan National Army units in a contested area. Intelligence suggests there's Taliban activity in the region, but nothing we can't handle. Just stay alert and stick to your training." "Understood, sir." Riley shouldered her rifle and moved toward the door, but Stone's voice stopped her. "Harper, for what it's worth, I've seen your scores at the range. I know what you're capable of. Don't let the doubters get in your head." The mission briefing was held in the base's operations center, a climate-controlled room filled with maps, computer screens, and the constant hum of radios. Major Lisa Grant, the battalion's intelligence officer, stood at the front of the room, a laser pointer in her hand as she indicated various positions on a large map of the Kandahar Valley. Grant was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who'd risen through the ranks on merit alone, and she commanded respect from even the most chauvinist soldiers in the unit. "Today's patrol will take us through 3 villages in Sector 7, Grant began, her voice crisp and professional. "Our mission is to conduct welfare checks, distribute medical supplies, and gather intelligence on Taliban movements in the area. The Afghan National Army will provide local support, but remember, we're operating in their country, so cultural sensitivity is paramount." She clicked to the next slide, showing satellite imagery of the patrol route. "The terrain is mostly open desert with some rocky outcroppings and abandoned compounds. Perfect ambush country, so stay alert. Weather forecast shows clear skies and temperatures reaching 42 degrees Celsius, so hydration discipline is critical." Riley studied the map intently, noting the elevation changes, the potential choke points, the areas where an enemy force might try to establish an ambush. It was the kind of tactical thinking that came naturally to her, the ability to see patterns and possibilities that others might miss. Her brother Tommy had possessed the same gift, the same instinctive understanding of terrain and enemy behavior that had made him an exceptional soldier until his luck ran out. "Questions?" Grant asked, scanning the room. When no one spoke up, she nodded to Captain Stone. "Captain, your show." Stone moved to the front of the room, his bearing commanding immediate attention. "Squad leaders, I want your people ready to move in 30 minutes. First squad will take point, second squad in the middle with the medical supplies, third squad brings up the rear. Harper, you're with third squad today. Morrison raised his hand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sir, respectfully, shouldn't Harper be in the middle with the supplies, given her experience level? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Stone's eyes narrowed slightly, and Riley could see him weighing his response. She knew. What Morrison was really asking, shouldn't the weak link be kept away from the dangerous positions? Harper's assignment stands, Stone said finally. She's a qualified soldier, same as the rest of you. If anyone has concerns about their fellow soldiers' capabilities, they can discuss it with me privately after the mission. His tone made it clear that such a discussion would not be pleasant. As the soldiers filed out of the briefing room to collect their gear, Riley found herself walking beside Sergeant Webb. The older man had been watching her quietly for weeks, and she'd sensed that unlike some of the others, his judgment of her was still pending rather than already decided. First real patrol? Webb asked, adjusting the straps on his equipment vest. Yes, Sergeant. I mean, I've done convoy escorts and checkpoint rotations, but nothing like this. Webb nodded thoughtfully. Different kind of stress out there. Not just the threat of enemy contact, but the responsibility. You're not just watching for trouble, you're protecting the whole unit. Some people crack under that pressure. Riley met his gaze steadily. I won't crack, Sergeant. Maybe not, Webb replied. But here's the thing about combat, Harper. It strips away all the bullshit, all the pretense. Out there, you find out who you really are. Sometimes that person is stronger than you expected. Sometimes they're not. The trick is being ready for either possibility. The convoy consisted of 4 up-armored Humvees and an MRAP, the mine-resistant vehicle that would carry the bulk of their medical supplies. Riley was assigned to the last Humvee, along with 3 other soldiers from 3rd Squad, Morrison, Chun, and Specialist Alex Torres, a quiet man from New Mexico who served as the squad's medic. The vehicle's armor plating made conversation difficult. Over the road noise, but Morrison seemed determined to continue his commentary on Riley's fitness for combat. I'm just saying, he shouted over the engine noise. This isn't some video game. When the shooting starts, people freeze up. It's natural. But when someone freezes up in combat, other people die. Torres, who was riding in the front passenger seat, turned around to face Morrison. Maybe save the tactical wisdom for after we see some action, Jake. You're starting to sound like a broken record. I'm just looking out for the unit, Morrison protested. We all have to trust each other out here, and trust is earned, not given. Riley said nothing, focusing instead on the landscape rolling past her window. The Kandahar Valley was a study in contrasts, beautiful in its harsh way, but deadly in its implications. Every hill could hide a sniper, every pile of rocks could conceal an improvised explosive device. The local population was caught between the coalition forces, trying to bring stability, and the Taliban fighters who used fear and intimidation to maintain control. It was a complex situation that couldn't be solved with simple answers or overwhelming firepower. The first village was typical of the region. Mud brick houses clustered around a central square, children playing in the dust despite the heat, old men sitting in whatever shade they could find. The patrol proceeded without incident, the soldiers distributing medical supplies, while the interpreters spoke with local leaders about security concerns. Riley noticed how the villagers watched them, their expressions careful and neutral. These people had survived decades of conflict by learning not to take sides too openly. The second village was smaller, more isolated, and the reception was noticeably cooler. Fewer people came out to greet the patrol, and those who did seemed nervous, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding hills. Captain Stone called a brief halt to consult with the Afghan National Army commander, a thin man named Colonel Ahmadu who spoke excellent English and had been fighting various forms of insurgency for 15 years. "Something's not right here," Ahmed told Stone, his voice low and urgent. "The people are afraid. More than usual. My sources in the village say there's been Taliban activity in the area, but they won't give specifics." Stone nodded grimly. "How recent? Last few days? Maybe they're already gone. Maybe they're watching us right now. In this business you never know until the shooting starts." The patrol resumed, but now there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Riley could feel it in the way the other soldiers moved, the increased alertness in their posture, the way their eyes constantly scanned the terrain around them. This was what Webb had been talking about, the weight of responsibility that came with knowing that danger could emerge from any direction at any moment. The third village was the most remote, nestled in a valley between two ridgelines that provided excellent observation points for anyone wanting to watch the patrol's movements. As they approached the settlement, Riley noticed something that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. The village was completely empty. No children playing in the streets, no women hanging laundry, no old men sitting in the shade. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished. "This is wrong," Torres muttered, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "Where is everybody?" Captain Stone's voice crackled over the radio. "All units, be advised, village appears deserted. Stay alert and maintain spacing. We're going to do a quick sweep and then get out of here." As the convoy rolled into the village square, Riley felt every nerve in her body come alive with awareness. Her training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming that they were walking into a trap. The buildings around them provided perfect cover for enemy fighters. The narrow streets would make maneuvering difficult if they came under attack, and the surrounding hills offered commanding views of their entire position. "I don't like this," Chen whispered, his young face pale with anxiety. "Where are all the people?" "Probably got word that Taliban were in the area and cleared out," Morrison replied, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Even he could sense that something was terribly wrong. The patrol dismounted and began a systematic search of the village, checking buildings and looking for any signs of enemy activity. Riley was assigned to help clear a compound on the eastern edge of the settlement, a collection of connected buildings that could house a significant number of fighters if occupied. As she moved through the rooms, rifle at the ready, she found evidence that the buildings had been recently occupied. Warm ashes and fire pits, food that hadn't yet spoiled, personal belongings that suggested a hasty departure. It was in the last building that she found the first sign of real trouble. Spent ammunition casings scattered across the floor, the brass still bright and new. Someone had been here recently, and they'd been armed with military-grade weapons. She was about to radio her discovery when the first shots rang out. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke of careful planning and professional execution. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the surrounding hills, the bullets striking the vehicles and buildings with metallic pings and the crack of splitting stone. Riley threw herself behind a concrete wall as rounds whistled overhead, her heart hammering in her chest as her training took over. "Contact front and flanks." Stone's voice came over the radio, calm despite the circumstances. "All units, return fire and seek cover. We need to get to the vehicles and extract." But even as he spoke, Riley could see that extraction might not be possible. The convoy was trapped in the center of the village with enemy fighters positioned on the high ground around them. 2 of the Humvees had already taken hits, and smoke was beginning to rise from their engines. The MRAP seemed intact, but it was parked on the far side of the square, separated from most of the patrol by 50 meters of open ground that was now being swept by enemy fire. Riley found herself pressed against the wall of the compound with Torres, Chen, and Morrison, all of them breathing hard as bullets continued to snap overhead. The medic was already working on his radio, trying to call for air support, while Morrison and Chun returned fire at muzzle flashes visible among the rocks above them. "How many do you think?" Torres shouted over the noise of gunfire. "At least 15, maybe 20, Morrison replied, pausing to reload his rifle. "They've got us surrounded. Professional job, too. These aren't some farmers with AK-47s. As if to emphasize his point, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the village square, exploding against one of the disabled Humvees and sending a pillar of smoke and flame into the air. The message was clear. The enemy had the firepower to destroy the patrol's vehicles and the tactical position to prevent any easy escape. Riley assessed their situation with the cold calculation that her brother had taught her during their hunting trips back in Colorado. They were pinned down in an indefensible position, outnumbered by at least 4-1, with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of reinforcement. The math was simple and terrifying, but it wasn't hopeless. "Not yet. Torres, what's the word on air support?" she called out. 10 minutes minimum, the medic replied, his face grim. "Apache gunships are inbound, but they need time to get here." 10 minutes might as well have been 10 hours. Riley could already see enemy fighters moving down from the hills, using the cover of buildings and abandoned vehicles to get closer to the patrol's position. Soon they would be close enough to use grenades, and the concrete walls that were currently providing protection would become death traps. That's when she heard Captain Stone's voice over the radio, tight with pain and urgency. "Third squad, this is 6. We've got multiple casualties here, including walking wounded who can't move without assistance. I need someone to hold the eastern approach while we organize an extraction to the MRAP." Riley looked around at her squad mates. Morrison was firing steadily but seemed overwhelmed by the intensity of the contact. Chun was basically frozen, crouched behind the wall with his rifle but not engaging the enemy. Only Torres seemed to be functioning at full capacity, but his attention was divided between treating wounded soldiers and coordinating support. The eastern approach that Stone had mentioned was a narrow alley between two buildings that provided the most direct route from the hills to the patrol's position. If enemy fighters could advance through that corridor, they would be able to attack the casualties while they were being moved to safety. Someone needed to hold that position, but it would be a one-person job at an extremely exposed location. Riley made her decision with the same quiet certainty that had guided her throughout her life. She checked her ammunition, ensuring that every magazine was properly seated, and made sure her radio was functioning. Then she looked at Torres, who was watching her with growing understanding. "I'm going to move to that eastern building," she said, pointing to a partially collapsed structure that would give her a clear view of the alley. "It's the best position to cover the approach." "That's suicide," Morrison protested, looking up from his rifle. "You'll be completely exposed out there. They'll cut you to pieces." Riley met his gaze steadily. "Maybe, or maybe I can buy enough." "Time for everyone to get to the MRAP," she keyed her radio. "Captain Stone, this is Harper. I'm moving to overwatch the eastern approach. Give me 2 minutes to get in position, then start your movement." Stone's response was immediate. "Negative, Harper. Too dangerous. We'll find another way." "Sir, with respect, there is no other way. Someone has to hold that position, and I'm the best shot in the squad." It wasn't a boast, just a statement of fact that everyone present knew to be true. There was a long pause before Stone's voice came back over the radio. "Roger, Harper. 2 minutes. Make them count." Riley took a deep breath, feeling the same strange calm that had always come over her during shooting competitions back home. The noise of battle seemed to fade into background static as she focused on the task ahead. This was what her brother would have done. This was what her training had prepared her for. This was her moment to prove that quiet strength could be just as powerful as loud bravado. She sprinted across the open ground between the buildings, bullets kicking up dust around her feet as enemy fighters tried to track her movement. The partially collapsed building she'd chosen for her position was little more than 3 walls and part of a roof, but it provided enough cover to allow her to engage targets while remaining relatively protected from return fire. As she settled into position behind a pile of rubble, Riley could see enemy fighters moving through the alley. At least 6 men with assault rifles and 1 carrying what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. They were advancing in a disciplined formation, using proper cover and movement techniques that confirmed these were experienced fighters rather than untrained insurgents. Riley steadied her rifle against the rubble, controlled her breathing, and began to do what she'd been born to do. Her first shot took down the fighter with the RPG launcher, the bullet striking him center mass and dropping him instantly. Her second shot caught another fighter as he tried to move between buildings, the round spinning him around before he collapsed in the dust. The enemy fighters immediately began searching for the source of the accurate fire, their return shots striking the walls around Riley's position but failing to find their mark. She shifted position slightly, just enough to present a different angle, and continued her methodical work. Her third shot, her fourth, each one carefully aimed, each one finding its target. This was the gift her brother had recognized in her years ago during their hunting trips in the Colorado mountains. The ability to remain calm under pressure and place shots with surgical precision. It wasn't about aggression or killer instinct. It was about discipline and skill, and the absolute certainty that came from thousands of hours of practice. The enemy fighters in the alley were now pinned down, unable to advance without exposing themselves to her rifle. But Riley knew this was only the beginning. The sound of her shots would draw attention from other enemy positions, and soon she would be facing fire from multiple directions. She had to make every shot count and every second matter. Over her radio, she could hear Captain Stone coordinating the movement of casualties toward the MRAP. Wounded soldiers were being carried across the village square, while other members of the patrol provided covering fire. The plan was working, but it depended entirely on Riley's ability to keep the eastern approach clear. More enemy fighters appeared in the alley, moving in short rushes from cover to cover as they tried to get close enough to use grenades. Riley tracked their movement with her scope, leading her targets and adjusting for the effects of heat and wind. Her fifth shot, her sixth. The enemy advance slowed as fighters took shelter behind anything that might stop a bullet. That's when she heard the distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round. The explosion struck the building next to her position, showering her with debris and temporarily deafening her. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear voices shouting in Pashto as the enemy fighters seized the opportunity to advance while she was momentarily stunned. Riley shook off the effects of the blast and returned to her rifle. The fighters were closer now, close enough that she could see their faces clearly through her scope. They were young men, probably not much older than her brother had been when he died in this same valley. But they were also the enemy, and they were trying to kill her friends. Her seventh shot stopped a fighter who was preparing to throw a grenade. Her eighth shot caught another as he tried to flank her position. But now she was taking heavy return fire from multiple directions, and the concrete around her was beginning to disintegrate under the impact of bullets. "Harper, what's your status?" Stone's voice crackled over the radio. "Still in position," Riley replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "How much longer do you need?" 2 more minutes. Can you hold?" Riley assessed her situation quickly. She had 3 full magazines remaining plus whatever rounds were left in her current magazine. The enemy fighters were getting closer, but they were also becoming more cautious, having learned to respect her marksmanship. 2 minutes was a long time in combat, but it wasn't impossible. "Roger that, Captain. 2 minutes." What happened next would become the stuff of legend in military circles, a story told and retold in barracks and officer clubs around the world. Riley Harper, The quiet soldier who read poetry and flinched at the sound of mortar, held that position for exactly 2 minutes and 17 seconds against overwhelming odds. She fired 23 shots and scored 21 hits, effectively stopping an entire squad of enemy fighters single-handedly. But more than the marksmanship, more than the tactical success, it was the way she conducted herself that would be remembered. Even as bullets shredded the air around her, even as the building she was sheltering in began to collapse under enemy fire, she remained calm and professional. Her radio calls were clear and concise. Her movements were deliberate and efficient. She fought like someone who had found exactly where she belonged. When the Apache gunships finally arrived and began engaging the enemy positions on the surrounding hills, Riley was still at her post, still watching the eastern approach, still ready to engage any threat that might emerge. It wasn't until Captain Stone personally ordered her to withdraw that she finally left her position and made her way back to where the rest of the patrol was consolidating around the MRAP. As she approached the vehicle, Riley could see the faces of her fellow soldiers watching her with expressions she'd never seen before. The mockery was gone, replaced by something that looked like awe. Morrison, who had spent weeks questioning her fitness for combat, simply stared at her in silence. Chun, the young private who had doubted her courage, actually stepped aside to make room for her as she climbed into the vehicle. But it was Sergeant Webb's reaction that affected her most. The grizzled veteran, who had served in more combat zones than most soldiers could count, nodded at her with unmistakable respect. "Good work, Harper," he said simply. "Damn good work." As the convoy began its movement back to Camp Ironwood, Riley sat quietly in the back of the MRAP, her rifle across her knees and her thoughts turning to her brother Tommy. She had finally understood what he had tried to tell her in his last letter home, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That strength came in many forms, and sometimes the quietest person in the room was also the strongest. The girl who had been dismissed as too soft for combat had just proven that the most dangerous enemy of all was the one you underestimated. And in the harsh landscape of Kandahar Valley, where perception often mattered more than reality, Riley Harper had finally shown her true face to the world. The debriefing room at Camp Ironwood felt different when Riley walked in 3 hours after the patrol's return. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the metal chairs colder, and the maps on the walls carried a weight they hadn't possessed that morning. She took her usual seat in the back corner, her rifle cleaned and secured, her gear properly stowed, but the dust of Kandahar Valley still seemed to cling to her uniform like a second skin. Major Lisa Grant stood at the front of the room, her tablet in hand, but her usual crisp demeanor seemed subdued. The intelligence officer's eyes swept across the assembled soldiers, lingering for a moment on Riley before moving on. Captain Stone sat to one side, his left arm in a sling from shrapnel wounds, his face bearing the careful neutrality of an officer trying to process what had just happened in his unit. The other members of the patrol filled the remaining chairs, their conversations muted and respectful in a way that was unusual for post-mission gatherings. Normally, soldiers would be joking about close calls, complaining about the heat, or planning their evening activities. Today, they spoke in whispers if they spoke at all, and more than one pair of eyes kept drifting toward the quiet woman in the corner, who had changed everything they thought they knew about combat. Morrison sat 3 seats away from Riley, his usual swagger completely absent. The man who had questioned her fitness for duty that morning now seemed unable to meet her gaze, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he stared at the floor. Chun looked even younger than his 19 years, his face pale and drawn as he processed his first real taste of combat. Only Torres seemed unchanged, the medic's professional calm intact as he reviewed his notes from treating the patrol's wounded. "Before we begin the formal after-action review," Grant said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I want to acknowledge that today's mission resulted in multiple casualties. 3 soldiers are currently receiving treatment for wounds sustained during the ambush, but all are expected to make full recoveries. The fact that we didn't lose anyone today is due to the professionalism and courage of every person in this room." She paused, consulting her tablet before continuing. "The enemy force we encountered was significantly larger and better organized than our intelligence had suggested. Preliminary assessment indicates we faced approximately 20 fighters, armed with military-grade weapons and coordinated tactics. This was not a random encounter, but a carefully planned ambush designed to inflict maximum casualties on coalition forces." Riley listened to the briefing with half her attention. The other half focused on processing what had happened to her during those crucial minutes in the collapsed building. She had always known she was a good shot, had always understood that her quiet nature masked a core of determination that ran deeper than most people realized. But today had been different. Today she had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known existed. When the shooting started, when her fellow soldiers were in danger, when the situation seemed hopeless, she had felt a strange sense of clarity descend over her like a protective veil. The noise and chaos of battle had faded into background static, leaving her with perfect focus and absolute certainty about what needed to be done. It was as if all the years of training, all the hours spent on shooting ranges, all the lessons her brother had taught her about remaining calm under pressure, had crystallized into a single moment of pure competence. "Sergeant Webb," Grant continued, "I'd like your assessment of the tactical situation we encountered." The grizzled veteran cleared his throat and stood up, his movements careful and deliberate. "Ma'am, the enemy had us dead to rights. They chose their ground well, waited until we were committed to the village, then hit us from multiple directions simultaneously. Classic L-shaped ambush with supporting fires from the high ground. If they'd had more patience, they could have waited until we were dismounted and vulnerable before initiating contact." Webb paused, his eyes finding Riley in the back of the room. "What saved us was individual initiative and exceptional marksmanship. Someone took it upon themselves to hold the key terrain that prevented the enemy from overrunning our casualty collection point. That person engaged multiple targets at extended range under heavy fire and achieved a hit rate that I've never seen in 30 years of military service." The room fell silent as the implications of Webb's words sank in. Riley felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized that everyone was looking at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright amazement. She had never sought attention or recognition, had always preferred to let her actions speak for themselves. But there was no hiding from what had happened today. Captain Stone shifted in his chair, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated his wounded arm. "Harper, I'd like you to walk us through your actions during the engagement. Start with your decision to move to the overwatch position." Riley stood up slowly, feeling suddenly self-conscious in a way she rarely experienced. Public speaking had never been her strength, preferring the written word to verbal communication, but she understood that this debriefing was important for lessons learned and future operations. "Sir, when you called for someone to cover the eastern approach, I assessed the tactical situation and determined that the partially collapsed building provided the best fields of fire to interdict enemy movement through that corridor." Her voice was steady but quiet, requiring everyone in the room to lean forward slightly to hear her clearly. The position was exposed, but it was the only location that offered both cover and concealment while maintaining visual contact with the likely avenue of approach. Stone nodded encouragingly. "What was your ammunition status when you made that decision?" "I had 4 full magazines plus a partial magazine in my weapon, sir. Approximately 110 rounds total." Rayleigh's answer was precise and factual, delivered without emotion or embellishment. "I calculated that with proper fire discipline and shot placement, that would be sufficient to delay enemy advance until air support arrived." Morrison finally looked up from the floor, his expression troubled. Harper, when you were taking fire from multiple directions, how did you stay so calm? I could hear you on the radio, and you sounded like you were ordering coffee instead of fighting for your life. The question caught Riley off guard, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wasn't sure how to explain it in a way that would make sense to others. How could she describe the strange peace that had settled over her when the shooting started? How could she explain that in the midst of chaos and violence, she had found a place of perfect stillness where fear couldn't reach her? "I don't know if calm is the right word," she said finally. "I was scared, just like everyone else. But fear can be useful if you don't let it control your actions. My brother taught me that when we were hunting back in Colorado. He said that the deer can smell your fear, so you have to find a way to acknowledge it without being paralyzed by it." Torres, who had been silent throughout the briefing, spoke up from his position near the front of the room. "Harper, I counted your shots from my position near the MRAP. 23 rounds fired, and I saw at least 20 enemy fighters go down or take cover. That's not just good marksmanship, that's exceptional shooting under the worst possible conditions." "The targets were well defined," Riley replied, her voice maintaining its characteristic quiet intensity. "Clear backgrounds, good contrast, ranges between 75 and 200 meters. The conditions were actually favorable for precision shooting once I established my firing position and accounted for environmental factors." Major Grant made a note on her tablet, then looked up at Riley with an expression that seemed to blend professional interest with something approaching wonder. "Harper, according to your personnel file, you scored expert on the rifle range during basic training and have maintained that qualification throughout your military career. But what you accomplished today goes well beyond standard marksmanship training. Where did you develop that level of skill?" Riley hesitated for a moment, thinking about her brother Tommy and the countless weekends they had spent together in the mountains outside Boulder Creek. Those had been some of the happiest times of her life, just the two of them moving quietly through the forest, learning to read the landscape and understand the behavior of their quarry. Tommy had been more than just a big brother to her. He had been her mentor, her teacher, and her closest friend. "My brother and I grew up hunting in Colorado, ma'am. He was in the Army before me, served 2 tours in Afghanistan before he was killed in action 2 years ago. He taught me that shooting isn't just about pulling the trigger, it's about understanding distance and wind and breathing and a dozen other factors that most people never think about. He said that if you're going to take a life, whether it's an animal or an enemy soldier, you owe it to that life to make it quick and clean." The room fell silent as Riley's words sank in. For the first time, her fellow soldiers were getting a glimpse of the person behind the quiet exterior, the experiences that had shaped her into someone capable of extraordinary performance under pressure. The girl who read poetry and seemed too gentle for war had been forged in the mountains of Colorado by a brother who understood that true strength came from discipline and respect for the gravity of taking life. Chun, who had barely spoken since returning from the patrol, finally found his voice. "Riley, when you were out there alone, engaging all those targets, weren't you afraid you were going to die?" Riley considered the question carefully before answering. "Yes, I was afraid. But I was more afraid of what would happen to all of you if I didn't do my job. Fear of failure can be stronger than fear of death, especially when other people are depending on you." Captain Stone leaned forward in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Harper, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. During the engagement, did you experience any hesitation about engaging human targets? Any psychological barriers that might have affected your performance?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, touching on one of the fundamental concerns about soldiers in combat. Many people could shoot accurately at targets on a range, but engaging human beings in combat was a different matter entirely. The psychological stress of taking life could cause even experienced soldiers to hesitate at crucial moments. and that hesitation could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Riley was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes focused on something beyond the walls of the debriefing room. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before, as if she was sharing something she had never put into words. "Sir, every time I looked through my scope, I saw the faces of the men I was engaging. They were young, probably not much older than my brother was when he died. Some of them looked scared, just like I was scared. But I also knew that they were trying to kill my friends, and that if I didn't stop them, good people were going to die for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time." She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to touch something beneath her uniform shirt. "I thought about my brother Tommy, about the last letter he wrote before he was killed. He said that being a soldier meant accepting responsibility for protecting the people around you, even if that meant making hard choices that would stay with you forever. So no, sir, I didn't hesitate. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary." Major Grant made another note on her tablet, but her attention remained focused on Riley with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. "Harper, your performance today was exceptional by any standard, but it also raises some questions about how we assess and utilize personnel in combat roles. Your previous assignments have been relatively low-risk positions, convoy escorts, and checkpoint duty. Based on what I observed today, that seems like a significant underutilization of your capabilities." Riley felt a familiar discomfort at being the center of attention, the same feeling she had experienced throughout her military career when superior officers tried to push her toward leadership roles or specialized assignments. She had never sought advancement or recognition, preferring to serve quietly and competently in whatever role she was assigned. "Ma'am, I've been satisfied with my current duties. I believe every job in the military is important, whether it's driving supplies or manning checkpoints. I never felt like I was being underutilized. But clearly you possess skills that could be valuable in other contexts," Grant persisted. "Have you ever considered applying for special operations training or advanced marksmanship programs?" The question touched on something Riley had wrestled with since joining the military. She knew she possessed capabilities that went beyond those of average soldiers, but she had always been reluctant to put herself forward for specialized roles. Part of it was her natural modesty, her discomfort with standing out from her peers. But a larger part was her desire to honor her brother's memory by serving in the same kind of line unit where he had died. "Ma'am, my brother served as a regular infantryman. He could have applied for special operations or sniper school, but he chose to stay with his unit because he believed that's where he could do the most good. I've tried to follow his example." Sergeant Webb, who had been listening to the exchange with growing interest, decided to interject. "Harper, with respect, your brother's dead. He can't benefit from your misplaced sense of loyalty, but the Army could sure as hell benefit from putting your skills to better use." The blunt words hit Riley like a physical blow, causing her to take an involuntary step backward. Webb's assessment was harsh but accurate, and she knew that her decision to limit her own potential was based more on emotion than logic. But the idea of leaving behind the type of service that had defined her brother's career felt like a betrayal of everything he had taught her. "Sergeant, I understand your point, but I believe I can serve effectively in my current role. Today's mission was unusual, but most of our duties don't require the kind of specialized skills we're discussing." Captain Stone had been watching the exchange with growing concern, recognizing that his quiet soldier was struggling with forces beyond simple career decisions. The loss of her brother clearly weighed heavily on her choices, and pushing too hard might drive her away from the military entirely. "Harper, let's table the discussion about future assignments for now. What's important is that your actions today saved lives and demonstrated the kind of courage and competence that defines the Pines, the best of our military. Whether you serve in a line unit or a specialized role, The Army is better for having soldiers like you." The formal debriefing continued for another hour, covering tactical lessons learned and recommendations for future operations. But the real significance of the session wasn't captured in the official reports or recommendations that would be filed with higher headquarters. What mattered was the transformation that had taken place in the relationships between the soldiers. In that room, Morrison, who had spent weeks questioning Riley's fitness for combat, now found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about strength and courage. The quiet woman who read poetry had demonstrated a level of battlefield competence that exceeded anything in his own experience, and the realization was forcing him to confront his own prejudices and assumptions. Shun, traumatized by his first real taste of combat, had found an unexpected source of inspiration in Riley's calm professionalism under fire. Her example had shown him that courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about doing your job despite fear. It was a lesson that would serve him well in the deployments and challenges that lay ahead. Torres, the medic who had treated the patrols, wounded, had gained a new appreciation for the complexity of combat leadership. Riley had demonstrated that true leadership sometimes meant taking on the most dangerous job yourself, rather than asking others to do what you wouldn't do. It was a principle that would influence his own approach to military service for years to come. Even Sergeant Webb, despite his harsh words about Riley's career choices, had been impressed by her performance and her mature approach to the psychological challenges of combat. In 30 years of military service, he had seen plenty of soldiers who could shoot accurately and follow orders, but few who possessed the combination of technical skill and moral strength that Riley had displayed. As the debriefing concluded, and the soldiers began to file out of the room, Major Grant approached Riley with a thoughtful expression. "Harper, I'd like to speak with you privately for a few minutes, if you don't mind." Riley remained in her seat as the room emptied, wondering what additional questions the intelligence officer might have. Grant was known throughout the battalion as someone who chose her words carefully and never wasted time on unnecessary conversations. "Harper, I want to be direct with you about something," Grant began, settling into a chair across from Riley. "What you accomplished today was remarkable, but it also raises some concerns about how we're managing talent in this organization. You clearly possess capabilities that extend far beyond your current role, and I think we're doing both you and the Army a disservice by not exploring better ways to utilize those skills." Riley shifted uncomfortably in her chair, sensing that this conversation was heading in a direction she wasn't prepared to go. "Ma'am, I appreciate your confidence, but I'm content with my current position. Not everyone needs to be a special operations soldier or a sniper. The Army needs people willing to do the everyday jobs too." Grant studied Riley's face for a moment, noting the tension around her eyes and the careful way she held herself. "Harper, can I ask you something personal? Are you avoiding advancement opportunities because you don't think you're ready for them, or because you're afraid of moving beyond the type of service your brother provided?" The question struck directly at the heart of Riley's internal struggle, forcing her to confront motivations she had been reluctant to examine too closely. She had told herself that her desire to serve in a line unit was about honoring Tommy's memory, but Grant's question made her wonder if it was really about fear of failing to live up to his example. "Ma'am, my brother was an exceptional soldier who died serving his country. I've tried to follow the path he laid out because I believe it's the right way to serve. I don't think that's a bad thing." "It's not a bad thing," Grant agreed, "but it might not be the best thing for you or for the soldiers you could help if you were in a position to share your skills more broadly. Harper, today you saved lives through exceptional individual performance. Imagine how many more lives you could save by training other soldiers to perform at even half your level." The idea had never occurred to Riley in quite those terms. She had always thought about military service in terms of personal contribution and individual responsibility, But Grant was suggesting a different model based on multiplication of capability rather than direct application of skill. "I'm not sure I'd be a good instructor, ma'am. I've never been comfortable in leadership roles, and teaching requires different skills than performing." Grant smiled slightly, the first time Riley had seen her display anything approaching warmth. "Harper, the best teachers are often the ones who understand their subject so deeply that they can break it down into component parts and explain it clearly to others. From what I observed today, you understand marksmanship and tactical decision-making at a level that most soldiers never achieve. That knowledge could be invaluable to younger soldiers who are just learning their craft." As Grant spoke, Riley found herself thinking about her brother's letters from his first deployment, when he had written about the satisfaction he found in mentoring newer soldiers and sharing the lessons he had learned. Tommy had always been generous with his knowledge, never jealous or protective of his expertise. Perhaps there was a way to honor his memory by helping others achieve their potential, rather than simply trying to replicate his career path. "Ma'am, if I were to consider additional training or a different assignment, what would that look like? I mean hypothetically." Grant's expression brightened, sensing that she might be making progress in what had seemed like an impossible conversation. "There are several options we could explore. The Army Marksmanship Unit is always looking for soldiers with exceptional shooting skills. The Sniper School at Fort Benning trains soldiers to engage targets at extended range under adverse conditions. There are also instructor positions at various training facilities where you could work with new soldiers just entering the military." Each option Grant described carried its own appeal and its own challenges. The Marksmanship Unit would allow Riley to focus entirely on shooting sports and training, but it would remove her from the operational army where she felt most useful. Sniper School would provide advanced training in the skills she had demonstrated today, but it would also involve a level of specialization that might separate her from the kind of soldiers her brother had served alongside. "Ma'am, could I have some time to think about this? Today has been overwhelming, and I don't want to make any decisions while I'm still processing what happened." Grant nodded understandingly. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Harper, I want you to consider one more thing. Your brother died serving his country, and that's a noble sacrifice that deserves to be honored. But the best way to honor his memory might not be to replicate his choices exactly. It might be to use the gifts you've been given to make the kind of difference he would have wanted to make if he had lived." As Riley walked back to her barracks, through the gathering dusk of the Afghan evening, she found herself thinking about her brother in ways she hadn't since his death 2 years earlier. She had spent so much time focusing on the loss, on the future that had been stolen from both of them, that she had forgotten to consider what Tommy would want for her if he were still alive. Her brother had always pushed her to excel, to take on challenges that stretched her capabilities and forced her to grow. He had never accepted excuses or allowed her to settle for mediocrity, even when she would have been content with less than her best effort. If Tommy were alive today, would he want her to limit herself to the same roles he had filled, or would he encourage her to explore the full extent of her potential? The barracks was quieter than usual when Riley entered, with most of the soldiers either at dinner or engaged in evening activities. She was grateful for the solitude, needing time to process not just the events of the day, but the implications for her future. She settled onto her cot and pulled out the worn paperback copy of Leaves of Grass that had been her constant companion throughout her deployment. But tonight, Whitman's words about the interconnectedness of all living things carried a different meaning than they had that morning. Today she had taken lives, had used her skills to kill other human beings in defense of her fellow soldiers. The weight of that responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders, not because she regretted her actions, but because she understood that crossing that line had changed her in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. As she turned the pages of her book, Riley found herself thinking about the faces she had seen through her rifle scope, The young men who had died because of her marksmanship. They had been the enemy, had been trying to kill her friends, but they had also been someone's sons, someone's brothers. The moral complexity of that reality was something she would have to carry for the rest of her life. But alongside the weight of having taken life, Riley also carried the knowledge that her actions had saved the lives of soldiers she cared about. Morrison, despite his earlier doubts about her fitness for combat, had made it home safely because of her accuracy with a rifle. Chun, traumatized but alive, would have the opportunity to grow and mature as a soldier. Torres would continue his vital work as a medic, treating the wounded and saving lives in future engagements. The mathematics of combat were harsh but clear. Her willingness to kill had preserved life. Her readiness to die had enabled others to live. It was a calculus that her brother had understood and accepted, and one that she would have to learn to live with as well. As Riley prepared for sleep, she made a decision that would shape the rest of her military career. Tomorrow she would speak with Major Grant about the training opportunities they had discussed. Not because she was ready to abandon her current role, but because she was beginning to understand that her brother's true legacy wasn't the specific job he had performed, but the principle of service he had embodied. Tommy had always used his gifts in service of others, had always sought ways to maximize his contribution to the mission and the welfare of his fellow soldiers. If Riley possessed skills that could be used to save more lives and train better soldiers, then failing to develop those skills would be a betrayal of everything her brother had taught her about duty and responsibility. The transformation that had begun in the collapsed building in Kandahar Valley was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid. Riley Harper, the quiet soldier who read poetry and seemed too gentle for war, was beginning to understand that true strength lay not in limiting herself to familiar roles, but in having the courage to grow into the person she was meant to become. Outside her window, the lights of Camp Ironwood twinkled in the desert darkness, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters returning from another mission. The war would continue, with or without her participation. But Riley was beginning to understand that she had a choice about how she would contribute to the effort to protect the people who depended on soldiers like her. As sleep finally claimed her, Riley dreamed not of the men she had killed, but of her brother Tommy, standing in a sunlit meadow in the Colorado mountains, with a rifle in his hands and a smile on his face. In the dream, he was proud of her, not for following in his footsteps, but for having the courage to find her own path forward. The training facility at Fort Benning, Georgia, was a world away from the dust and heat of Afghanistan, but Riley Harper felt more out of place here than she ever had in a combat zone. The sniper school occupied a sprawling complex of buildings and ranges tucked into the pine forests of western Georgia, where some of the military's most elite marksmen came to perfect their deadly craft. Riley had been at the school for 3 weeks now, and every day brought new challenges that tested not just her shooting skills, but her ability to adapt to an environment where she was constantly being evaluated and compared to her peers. The morning began, as always, at 0500 hours with physical training that was designed to push students to their physical and mental limits. Riley had always been in good shape, but the fitness standards at sniper school were brutal even by military standards. The instructors believed that accuracy under stress required a level of physical conditioning that went far beyond normal requirements, and they structured their training accordingly. Riley fell into formation alongside the other students in her class, 23 soldiers and Marines who had been selected from thousands of applicants based on their demonstrated marksmanship abilities and psychological evaluations. The group was overwhelmingly male, with only 2 women including Riley, and the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of competition that was both motivating and exhausting. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, the senior instructor for Riley's class, stood before the formation with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. Johnson was a legend in military sniper circles, with confirmed kills spanning 3 deployments and a reputation for training some of the most effective precision shooters in the armed forces. He was also known for his uncompromising standards and his willingness to dismiss students who couldn't meet the school's demanding requirements. "Good morning, students," Johnson called out, his voice carrying clearly across the formation, despite the early morning mist that clung to the Georgia pines. "Today we begin week 4 of your training, which means you've survived longer than 40% of the students who started this course. Congratulations. Now forget everything you think you've accomplished, because this is where the real work begins." Riley had learned to appreciate Johnson's direct communication style, even when his feedback was brutally honest about her performance. Unlike some of the other instructors, who seemed to take pleasure in breaking down students' confidence, Johnson's criticism was always constructive and focused on improvement rather than humiliation. He had recognized something in Riley's approach to marksmanship that set her apart from many of her classmates, a natural understanding of the relationship between shooter, weapon, and environment that couldn't be taught through conventional methods. The physical training session began with a 5-mile run through the forest trails that surrounded the school, followed by an hour of calisthenics designed to build the core strength and stability that were essential for precision shooting. Riley had always been a capable runner, but maintaining pace with soldiers who had been selected specifically for their physical capabilities required her to push beyond her normal limits. As they moved through the forest in the pre-dawn darkness, Riley found herself running beside Lance Corporal David Kim, a Marine from California who had quickly established himself as one of the top performers in the class. Kim was everything that popular culture expected from a military sniper: calm, methodical, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless for hours at a time while observing potential targets. "Harper, you doing okay?" Kim asked quietly, noticing that Riley's breathing was becoming more labored as they approached the halfway point of their run. "You look like you're pushing pretty hard." Riley managed a small smile despite her exertion. "I'm fine, just working through some mental adjustments. The physical stuff is actually the easy part for me." Kim nodded understandingly. "Yeah, I get that. The shooting comes naturally to you, but all the other stuff, the fieldcraft and camouflage and tactical movement, that's where most people struggle. You're doing better than you think, though. Johnson wouldn't keep pushing you if he didn't see potential." The observation was more perceptive than Riley had expected from someone she barely knew, but it reflected the kind of attention to detail that was required for success in the sniper program. Students learned to observe everything around them, to notice patterns and changes that others might miss, and that skill extended to their interactions with fellow students as well as their tactical training. After the run, the class moved to the rifle range for what Johnson called stress shooting, a series of exercises designed to simulate the physical and mental pressures of combat engagement. Students were required to complete demanding physical tasks, then immediately transition to precision shooting at various ranges and under different conditions. The goal was to develop the ability to maintain accuracy even when exhausted, stressed, or operating under time constraints. Riley's first exercise required her to low crawl through a 100-meter obstacle course filled with mud, barbed wire, and simulated explosions, then immediately engage 5 targets at ranges between 300 and 600 meters. She had 30 seconds to identify, range, and engage each target, with points deducted for misses or excessive time between shots. As she settled into her shooting position, Riley felt the familiar calm descend over her that she had experienced during the firefight in Afghanistan. The noise and chaos of the training environment faded into background static, leaving her with perfect focus on the task at hand. Her first shot struck the 300-meter target center mass. Her second shot hit the 400-meter target in the upper chest. The pattern continued through all 5 targets, each round finding its mark with the kind of precision that drew nods of approval from the observing instructors. "Outstanding shooting, Harper," Johnson called out as Riley completed the exercise. Time was 4 minutes, 32 seconds, with 5 hits out of 5 shots. "That puts you in the top 10% of students we've seen this year." The praise felt good, but Riley knew that marksmanship was only one component of the training she would need to master. The sniper school curriculum included extensive instruction in fieldcraft, camouflage, target identification, range estimation, and tactical movement, all skills that required different types of knowledge and practice than pure shooting ability. Her next challenge came during the afternoon camouflage exercise, where students were required to move undetected through a wooded area, while instructors with binoculars and spotting scopes tried to identify their positions. The exercise tested not just the students' ability to blend into their environment, but their understanding of how movement, shadow, and contrast could reveal their presence to trained observers. Riley had struggled with camouflage techniques since arriving at the school, finding it difficult to overcome her instinctive desire to move quickly and efficiently between positions. The patient, methodical approach required for effective concealment was alien to her natural temperament, and she had been spotted and eliminated from previous exercises more often than she cared to admit. This time, however, she tried a different approach based on something her brother Tommy had taught her during their hunting trips in Colorado. Instead of focusing on moving without being seen, she concentrated on moving in ways that appeared natural within the environment. Rather than trying to become invisible, she tried to become unremarkable, just another part of the forest landscape that wouldn't draw attention from casual observation. The technique worked better than she had expected. Riley managed to cover nearly 200 meters through dense woodland without being detected, using terrain features and natural cover to mask her movement while maintaining a steady pace toward her objective. When she finally reached the designated endpoint, she was surprised to discover that she was the third student to arrive, having outperformed several classmates who had previously excelled at fieldcraft exercises. "Better, Harper," Johnson commented as she reported to the checkpoint. "You're starting to understand that camouflage isn't about disappearing. It's about not being worth a second look. Keep working on that approach and you'll see continued improvement." The evening brought classroom instruction in advanced ballistics and environmental factors that affected long-range shooting. Riley had always been interested in the scientific aspects of marksmanship, the mathematical relationships between bullet weight, muzzle velocity, atmospheric pressure, and wind speed. That determined whether a shot would hit or miss its intended target. The precision required for successful sniper operations demanded an understanding of physics and meteorology that went far beyond basic rifle marksmanship. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, the school's ballistics instructor, stood before a whiteboard covered with equations and diagrams that illustrated the complex factors affecting bullet flight. Rodriguez was one of the few female instructors at the school, a former sniper herself who had transitioned to teaching after completing multiple combat deployments. Her presence provided a role model for Riley and the other female student in the class, proof that women could succeed in this demanding field. "Tonight we're going to discuss the effects of altitude and temperature on bullet trajectory," Rodriguez began, gesturing to a chart that showed the relationship between elevation and air density. "Most of you have been shooting at or near sea level for your entire careers, but combat operations often take place at significant altitude where the thinner air can dramatically affect your point of impact." Riley found herself taking extensive notes as Rodriguez explained how reduced air density at higher elevations caused bullets to fly higher and faster than they would at sea level, requiring adjustments in both aiming point and range estimation. The information was highly technical, but it was exactly the kind of detailed knowledge that separated professional snipers from talented recreational shooters. "Harper," Rodriguez called out, "you've got combat experience in Afghanistan, which means you've dealt with altitude effects. Can you share any observations about how elevation affected your shooting? Riley felt the familiar discomfort of being singled out in a group setting, but she recognized that Rodriguez was trying to help her connect classroom theory with practical experience. Sergeant, most of my combat experience was at relatively low elevation, but I did notice that my rifle seemed to shoot slightly high compared to my zero during some engagements. At the time, I attributed it to adrenaline or shooting position, but the altitude explanation makes more sense. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of real-world observation that validates the theory we're discussing. The key is learning to recognize these effects and compensate for them before they cause you to miss a critical shot. As the evening classroom session continued, Riley found herself thinking about the broader implications of the training she was receiving. The level of technical knowledge required for advanced marksmanship was far beyond anything she had encountered in basic military training, and she was beginning to understand why sniper positions were considered among the most challenging specialties in the armed forces. But more than the technical complexity, she was struck by the psychological demands of the training. Sniper operations often required soldiers to work alone or in very small teams, making life-and-death decisions without immediate supervision or support. The weight of that responsibility was something that couldn't be taught through classroom instruction or range exercises. It had to be developed through experience and demonstrated through performance under pressure. After the formal training day ended, Riley often found herself staying behind to practice skills that she felt needed additional work. Tonight, she made her way to the school's indoor range, where students were allowed to conduct individual training during off-duty hours. The facility was equipped with electronic targets that could simulate various ranges and conditions, allowing for extensive practice without the logistical requirements of outdoor shooting. She was surprised to find that she wasn't alone in the facility. Lance Corporal Kim was set up at one of the shooting positions, methodically working through a series of exercises designed to improve his ability to engage moving targets. He looked up as Riley entered, offering a friendly nod before returning to his practice. "Long day?" Riley asked as she began setting up her own equipment at a nearby position. Kim paused in his shooting routine and turned to face her. "Yeah, but a good one. I feel like I'm finally starting to understand some of the concepts Rodriguez was talking about regarding wind reading. How about you? You seemed pretty engaged during the ballistics lecture." Riley finished adjusting her rifle's position and looked over at Kim. "I've always been interested in the science behind shooting, but this level of detail is new for me. In Afghanistan, most of my engagements were at relatively short range where environmental factors didn't play as big a role." "Afghanistan? Huh." Kim's expression grew more serious. "I heard you had some significant combat experience before coming here. That firefight where you held off a whole Taliban squad by yourself." Riley felt heat rising in her cheeks at the mention of her previous deployment. The story had somehow followed her to sniper school, growing in the telling until it bore little resemblance to her actual experience. She had never been comfortable with the attention or the way other students seemed to view her as some kind of combat legend. "It wasn't as dramatic as people make it sound," she said quietly. "I was in the right place at the right time with the right training. Any competent soldier would have done the same thing." Kim studied her face for a moment, recognizing the discomfort her answer revealed. "Harper, can I ask you something? Why are you here? I mean, with your combat record, you could probably write your own ticket in terms of military assignments. Why put yourself through this grinder when you've already proven yourself in actual combat?" The question touched on something Riley had been wrestling with since arriving at Fort Benning. She had come to sniper school partly because Major Grant had convinced her that her skills could be better utilized in a specialized role, but also because she was trying to understand what her brother would have wanted for her if he had lived. To see her potential fully realized. I'm here because I think I can do more good as a trained sniper than I could in a regular infantry role, she said finally. Not because I want the prestige or the recognition, but because I believe these skills could help me save more lives in future deployments. Kim nodded thoughtfully. That's a good reason. Better than some of the guys in our class who seem to be here because they think being a sniper will make them some kind of superhero. The instructors can usually spot those attitudes pretty quickly. As they continued their practice session, Riley found herself appreciating Kim's straightforward approach to both training and conversation. Unlike some of the other students who seemed more interested in competition and establishing dominance within the group, Kim appeared genuinely focused on mastering the skills being taught and helping his fellow students succeed as well. Their practice was interrupted by the arrival of Staff Sergeant Johnson, who entered the range with the purposeful stride that indicated he had something important to discuss. Both students immediately stopped their shooting and turned to face the instructor, unsure whether they were about to receive additional training or discipline for some unknown infraction. Relax, both of you, Johnson said, noting their immediate attention. I'm not here to bust anyone's chops. I just wanted to check in and see how you're adapting to the program. He looked directly at Riley as he continued. Harper, I've been reviewing your performance over the past 3 weeks, and I wanted to give you some feedback. Riley felt her stomach tighten with anxiety, uncertain whether Johnson's feedback would be positive or negative. The sniper school had a reputation for brutal honesty in its evaluations, and instructors were known for dismissing students who couldn't meet their standards, regardless of previous military experience or achievements. Your marksmanship scores are consistently in the top 5% of students we've trained, Johnson continued, but your fieldcraft and tactical movements still need significant work. You're thinking like an infantry soldier instead of a sniper, focusing on speed and aggression instead of patience and stealth. The assessment was accurate, and Riley knew it. Her instincts in tactical situations were shaped by her experience. In conventional operations, where quick decision-making and immediate action were often more important than careful planning and methodical execution. Sergeant, I understand the issue, but I'm having trouble overriding my training and experience. When I see a tactical problem, my first instinct is to solve it through direct action rather than careful observation and planning. Johnson smiled slightly, the first time Riley had seen him display anything approaching humor. Harper, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The Army needs soldiers who can think quickly and act decisively under pressure. But sniper operations require a different mindset, one that values precision over speed and patience over aggression. He paused, consulting a notebook he had pulled from his pocket. I'm going to make a suggestion that might help you with this transition. There's an advanced course being offered next month at the Army's Mountain Warfare School in Vermont. It focuses on long-range operations in difficult terrain, the kind of patient, methodical work that defines successful sniper operations. I think it would be valuable training for someone with your background and potential. Riley felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of additional training, but also some apprehension about the time commitment and the increasing specialization of her military career. Each step deeper into the sniper community took her further away from the conventional infantry role that her brother had filled, and she was still wrestling with whether that represented growth or abandonment of her original goals. Sergeant, I appreciate the recommendation, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of specialization. I came here to improve my skills, not to become a career sniper. Johnson's expression grew more serious as he responded. Harper, let me be direct with you about something. You have natural abilities that are extremely rare in military circles. Your combination of marksmanship skill, tactical awareness, and psychological stability under pressure is something we see maybe once every few hundred students. Wasting that potential by limiting yourself to conventional roles would be a disservice to both you and the soldiers who could benefit from your capabilities. The comment echoed Major Grant's earlier observations about Riley's potential and her responsibility to develop her skills for the benefit of others. But hearing it from Johnson, whose reputation and experience commanded respect throughout the special operations community, carried additional weight and significance. Kim had been listening quietly to the conversation, decided to offer his own perspective. "Harper, if it helps, I can tell you that everyone in our class respects your abilities. Not because of what happened in Afghanistan, but because of how you approach training here. You work harder than anyone else to improve your weak areas. And you never act like your combat experience makes you better than the rest of us." Riley felt a warmth at Kim's words that surprised her with its intensity. Throughout her military career, she had often felt like an outsider, tolerated, but not fully accepted by her male peers. The idea that her fellow students at sniper school saw her as a valuable team member rather than a diversity checkbox was more meaningful than any individual achievement or recognition. "Thank you both," she said quietly. "This conversation has given me a lot to think about. Sergeant Johnson, I'd like to learn more about the mountain warfare course you mentioned. Not because I'm ready to commit to it, but because I want to understand what it would involve." Johnson nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right approach, Harper. Never commit to training or assignments without understanding what you're getting into. I'll get you the course information tomorrow, and you can take as much time as you need to make your decision." As the instructor left the range and Riley and Kim returned to their practice, Riley found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a conventional soldier struggling to find her place in a combat unit that questioned her fitness for military service. Now she was training at one of the military's most elite schools, being encouraged to pursue additional specialized training by instructors whose opinions carried significant weight in special operations circles. The transformation hadn't been easy or comfortable. Every day brought new challenges that forced her to confront her limitations and push beyond her comfort zone. But Riley was beginning to understand that growth required discomfort, that the process of becoming the soldier she was meant to be would necessarily involve leaving behind the safety of familiar roles and expectations. As she lined up her next shot at the electronic target, Riley thought about her brother Tommy and the advice he had given her during their last conversation before his deployment to Afghanistan. He had told her that the military would try to put her in a box based on other people's expectations and assumptions, but that her responsibility was to define her own path based on her capabilities and her desire to serve others. Tommy had understood something about potential and purpose that Riley was only now beginning to grasp. Success in military service wasn't about finding a comfortable niche and staying there. It was about continuously challenging yourself to grow and develop in ways that maximized your contribution to the mission and the welfare of your fellow soldiers. The shot broke cleanly, striking the target's center ring with the kind of precision that had become second nature to Riley through countless hours of practice. But more than the technical achievement, the shot represented something deeper: her growing confidence in her ability to succeed in challenging environments and her willingness to embrace opportunities that would have intimidated her just months earlier. As Riley packed up her equipment and prepared to return to the barracks, she made a mental note to call Major Grant the next day and update her on the training progress. Grant had been instrumental in encouraging Riley to pursue advanced training, and she deserved to know how that investment was paying off in terms of skill development and professional growth. But more than that, Riley wanted to thank Grant for seeing potential that she hadn't recognized in herself, and for having the courage to push her toward opportunities that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The quiet soldier who had once been dismissed as too soft for combat was becoming something new and different, someone whose capabilities were limited only by her willingness to embrace the challenges that lay ahead. The Georgia night was warm and humid as Riley walked back to her quarters, the sound of insects and night birds creating a natural symphony that was very different from the harsh silence of the Afghan desert. But despite the change in environment, she felt a familiar sense of purpose and direction that had been missing from her life since her brother's death. For the first time since joining the military, Riley Harper felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 3 years later, Master Sergeant Riley Harper stood at the window of her office at the Infantry Training Center in Fort Moore, Georgia, watching a group of young soldiers struggle through their first week of advanced marksmanship training. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training area, and she could see the frustration in their movements as they attempted to master skills that had once seemed impossibly difficult to her as well. Now, as the non-commissioned officer in charge of the precision marksmanship program, Riley was responsible for transforming these eager but inexperienced soldiers into competent marksmen who could protect themselves and their units in combat. The transformation in Riley's own career had been remarkable by any measure. After completing both sniper school and the mountain warfare course that Staff Sergeant Johnson had recommended, she had deployed twice more to Afghanistan as part of a special operations unit, where her skills had been utilized in ways that maximized their impact on mission success. Her reputation had grown within the special operations community, not just for her exceptional marksmanship, but for her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure and her talent for mentoring younger soldiers. But it was her decision to accept the instructor position at Fort Moore that had truly defined the next phase of her military career. Rather than continuing in operational roles that would have enhanced her personal reputation, Riley had chosen to focus on developing the capabilities of other soldiers, believing that her knowledge and experience could have greater impact through teaching than through individual performance. The decision hadn't been easy. Special operations assignments carried prestige and excitement that instructor positions couldn't match, and many of her peers had questioned her choice to step away from elite units for what they saw as a less challenging role. But Riley had learned to measure success differently than many of her contemporaries, focusing on long-term impact rather than immediate recognition. Her first challenge as an instructor had been adapting her teaching methods to work with soldiers whose backgrounds and abilities varied dramatically from her own. The students in her program ranged from 19-year-old privates with minimal shooting experience to seasoned non-commissioned officers who were seeking to improve their marksmanship skills for leadership roles. Each group required different approaches to instruction, and Riley had to develop the flexibility to adjust her teaching style based on the needs of individual students. The program she had inherited was solid but conventional, focused primarily on technical marksmanship skills without much attention to the psychological and tactical factors that affected shooting performance in combat. Riley had gradually expanded the curriculum to include stress shooting exercises, decision-making under pressure, and the mental preparation techniques that had served her well during her own combat deployments. Her approach had proven controversial among some of the other instructors, who argued that she was making the training unnecessarily complex for soldiers who would primarily be using their rifles for basic defensive purposes. But Riley's combat experience gave her credibility that was difficult to argue with, and her success rate in improving student performance had gradually won over even her most skeptical colleagues. This morning's class consisted of 12 soldiers from various units across the installation, all of whom had been selected for advanced marksmanship training based on their demonstrated aptitude and their unit commander's recommendations. Riley had been working with this group for 2 weeks, and she was beginning to see the individual personalities and learning styles that would determine how she structured the remainder of their training. Private First Class Angela Martinez was clearly the most gifted natural shooter in the group, with an instinctive understanding of sight alignment and trigger control that reminded Riley of her own early development. But Martinez was also impatient and prone to rushing her shots when she encountered difficult targets, a tendency that would limit her effectiveness in tactical situations where precision was more important than speed. Sergeant Robert Chun, no relation to the young soldier Riley had served with in Afghanistan, was methodical and disciplined in his approach to shooting, but struggled with the mental aspects of marksmanship. His technical skills were solid, but he became frustrated easily when his performance didn't meet his own high expectations, and that frustration inevitably led to degraded accuracy. Corporal James Washington had been recommended for the program by his company commander after demonstrating exceptional performance during his unit's weapons qualification, but he was having difficulty adapting to the more demanding standards of precision marksmanship. His military bearing was excellent and his attitude was positive, but he lacked the patience required for the kind of deliberate, methodical shooting that the program emphasized. As Riley watched the students work through their morning exercises, she reflected on the lessons she had learned about teaching and leadership during her 3 years as an instructor. The most important realization had been that effective instruction required more than just technical knowledge. It demanded an understanding of how different people learned and what motivated them to push beyond their comfort zones. Her own learning style had always been intensely focused and self-directed, driven by internal motivation and a desire to honor her brother's memory through exceptional performance. But many of her students were motivated by different factors: the desire to impress their peers, the need to meet their unit's expectations, or simply the satisfaction of mastering a challenging skill. Riley had learned to identify these different motivational patterns and adjust her teaching approach accordingly. For students like Martinez, who were naturally gifted but impatient, she emphasized the importance of consistency over individual brilliant performances. For methodical students like Chen, she focused on building confidence and resilience in the face of temporary setbacks. For dedicated but struggling students like Washington, she provided additional individual attention and simplified complex concepts into manageable components. The morning's training began with a classroom session on environmental factors affecting long-range shooting, one of the areas where Riley's specialized training provided the most value to her students. The technical knowledge she had acquired at sniper school and during her deployments was far beyond what most soldiers needed for their basic duties, but she had learned to distill that information into practical lessons that enhanced their effectiveness, without overwhelming them with unnecessary complexity. Today we're going to discuss wind reading and range estimation. Riley began, standing in front of a classroom filled with soldiers whose attention levels varied considerably depending on their individual interest in the subject matter. These are skills that can make the difference between hitting and missing your target, especially at ranges beyond 300 meters. She had learned to begin her lessons with practical examples that connected abstract concepts to real-world situations her students might encounter. Rather than starting with mathematical formulas and theoretical discussions, she preferred to describe specific scenarios where environmental awareness had affected shooting outcomes during her own combat experience. 2 years ago, I was providing overwatch for a patrol in eastern Afghanistan when they came under fire from an enemy position approximately 400 meters away. The wind was gusting from my left at about 15 miles per hour, and the temperature was significantly higher than it had been when I zeroed my rifle that morning. If I had ignored those environmental factors and simply aimed center mass on the target, I would have missed by at least 6 inches, possibly more. Riley could see that the story had captured her students' attention in a way that technical explanations rarely achieved. Combat anecdotes provided context that made abstract concepts meaningful, and they helped her students understand why the skills they were learning mattered beyond simply passing tests or meeting qualification standards. The key to successful wind reading isn't having perfect information about wind speed and direction. She continued, moving to a whiteboard where she had drawn diagrams illustrating different wind patterns. It's developing the ability to observe environmental indicators and make reasonable estimates based on available information. As the classroom session progressed, Riley found herself thinking about the evolution of her own teaching style and the ways it had been influenced by the instructors who had shaped her development. Staff Sergeant Johnson's direct, no-nonsense approach had taught her the importance of clear communication and honest feedback. Sergeant Rodriguez's emphasis on connecting theory to practical application had shown her how to make complex subjects accessible to students with varying levels of background knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned from Major Grant's example about the importance of seeing potential in people who might not recognize it in themselves. Grant had pushed Riley toward opportunities that had seemed beyond her capabilities at the time, and that experience had taught her to look for hidden strengths in her own students, rather than focusing solely on their obvious limitations. After the classroom session, the group moved to the outdoor range for practical exercises in wind reading and range estimation. Riley had designed a series of challenges that required students to engage targets at various distances under different environmental conditions, forcing them to apply the theoretical knowledge they had just learned in realistic shooting scenarios. The range at Fort Moore was significantly more sophisticated than the facilities Riley had trained on as a young soldier, with electronic targets that could simulate movement and provide immediate feedback on shot placement. But she had learned that technology was only useful if it enhanced rather than replaced fundamental marksmanship skills, and she structured her training accordingly. Private Martinez was the first student to attempt the wind reading exercise, engaging a target at 350 meters in a crosswind that was gusting unpredictably between 10 and 20 miles per hour. Riley watched through her spotting scope as Martinez settled into her shooting position, taking time to observe the grass and vegetation around the target area before making her wind estimate. Martinez's first shot struck slightly left of center, indicating that she had underestimated the wind's effect on her bullet's trajectory. But instead of immediately adjusting her point of aim, she took additional time to reassess the environmental conditions and recalculate her wind estimate before firing her second shot. The second shot struck much closer to the target center, and Martinez's third shot was nearly perfect. Riley noted with satisfaction that the young soldier was learning to treat each shot as a learning opportunity, rather than simply trying to achieve immediate success through trial and error. "Good work, Martinez," Riley called out as the private completed her string of fire. "You're learning to use your misses as information rather than getting frustrated by them. That's exactly the right approach for this type of shooting." Sergeant Chun was next to attempt the exercise, and Riley could see the tension in his posture as he prepared to engage the target. Chun's technical skills were solid, but his tendency toward perfectionism often worked against him in situations that required adaptive thinking and resilience in the face of imperfect conditions. Chun's first shot was technically sound but missed the target entirely, sailing over the top due to what appeared to be an error in range estimation rather than wind reading. Riley could see the frustration building in Chun's body language as he realized his mistake, and she moved closer to provide coaching before his emotional state could degrade further. "Chun, talk me through your range estimation process," Riley said quietly, positioning herself where she could observe both the student and the target through her own optics. "What indicators did you use to determine the distance to target?" Chun took a deep breath before responding, clearly working to control his frustration. "Sergeant, I estimated the range at 300 meters based on the target's apparent size, but I think I may have underestimated. The target looks smaller than it should at that distance." Riley nodded approvingly. "That's good analysis. The target is actually at 350 meters, which means your bullet impacted high because you didn't account for the additional bullet drop at the longer range. Make your adjustment and try again." Chun's second shot was much more accurate, striking within the target's center ring and demonstrating that his technical skills were solid once he had correct information about the shooting conditions. Riley made a mental note to work with Chun individually on building confidence in his ability to make accurate estimates under pressure. As the training session continued, Riley found herself reflecting on the broader implications of the work she was doing as an instructor. Each student she trained would return to their units with improved capabilities that could potentially save lives in combat situations. The marksmanship skills they were learning would make them more effective soldiers, but more importantly, the confidence and decision-making abilities they were developing would serve them well in any challenging situation they might encounter. The afternoon brought a different type of training exercise, one that Riley had developed based on her own combat experience in Afghanistan. Rather than simply shooting at stationary targets under controlled conditions, her students were required to engage multiple targets while moving between positions and making tactical decisions about target priority and engagement sequence. The exercise was designed to simulate the kind of complex dynamic situations that soldiers might face in actual combat, where pure marksmanship skill had to be combined with tactical awareness and sound decision-making under pressure. Riley had learned during her own deployments that the ability to shoot accurately was only one component of effective combat performance, and she wanted her students to understand that relationship before they found themselves in life or death situations. Corporal Washington was selected to demonstrate the exercise for the rest of the class, moving through a course that required him to engage 6 targets at various ranges while advancing from one covered position to another. The scenario was designed to test not just his shooting ability, but his capacity to prioritize targets based on threat level and his skill at moving tactically while maintaining situational awareness. Washington's performance was methodical and professional, though not exceptional in terms of pure speed or accuracy. He took time to properly assess each target before engaging, moved carefully between positions to minimize his exposure to hypothetical enemy fire, and maintained good muzzle discipline throughout the exercise. His shot placement was solid if not spectacular, with 5 hits out of 6 shots fired. "Good work, Washington," Riley called out as the corporal completed the course. "Your tactical movement was excellent, and your target prioritization showed good judgment. The miss on target 4 was due to rushing your shot after a good movement. Remember that speed is only valuable if it doesn't compromise accuracy." As Washington rejoined the group, Riley addressed the entire class about the lessons demonstrated by the exercise. What Corporal Washington just showed you is that effective combat shooting isn't about being the fastest or achieving perfect accuracy on every shot. It's about making good decisions under pressure and maintaining professional standards even when the situation is complex and stressful. She gestured toward the course that Washington had just completed. In actual combat, you'll rarely have the luxury of perfect shooting conditions or unlimited time to engage your targets. The skills you're learning here are designed to give you the confidence and capability to perform effectively when conditions are far from ideal. The training day concluded with an individual counseling session between Riley and each of her students, a practice she had instituted to ensure that everyone received personalized feedback and guidance tailored to their specific needs and goals. These sessions were often the most valuable part of the training program, allowing Riley to address individual concerns and provide mentorship that went beyond pure technical instruction. Private Martinez was her first appointment, and Riley could see that the young soldier had something specific on her mind as she entered the small office that served as Riley's counseling space. "Sergeant Harper, I wanted to ask you about opportunities for advanced training," Martinez began, her voice carrying the kind of earnest intensity that Riley remembered from her own early military career. "I've been doing some research about sniper school and other specialized programs, and I'm wondering if you think I have the potential for that kind of training." Riley studied Martinez's face, recognizing the ambition and drive that had once motivated her own pursuit of advanced military education. But she also saw some of the same impatience and desire for immediate advancement that could be problematic if not properly channeled. "Martinez, you definitely have the natural shooting ability for advanced training," Riley said carefully. Your marksmanship scores are consistently excellent, and you have good instincts for reading environmental conditions. But specialized programs like Sniper School require more than just shooting skills. They demand patience, discipline, and emotional maturity that can only be developed through experience. Martinez nodded, but Riley could see that she was hoping for more encouragement than caution. "Sergeant, I understand that, but I feel like I'm ready for more challenging training. The basic marksmanship program feels too easy for me, and I want to push myself toward my full potential." The comment reminded Riley of conversations she had had with Major Grant years earlier, when she had been reluctant to pursue opportunities that might take her beyond her comfort zone. But Martinez's situation was different. She was eager to advance rather than hesitant, and that eagerness could be both an asset and a liability, depending on how it was managed. "Martinez, let me ask you something," Riley said, leaning forward in her chair. "Why do you want advanced training? Is it because you believe it will make you a more effective soldier, or because you want the recognition and prestige that come with specialized qualifications?" The question clearly caught Martinez off guard, and Riley could see her struggling to formulate an honest answer. "I think it's both, Sergeant. I want to be the best soldier I can be, but I also want to be recognized for my abilities and given opportunities to use them in meaningful ways." Riley appreciated the honesty of Martinez's response, even though it revealed some concerning attitudes about military service and career advancement. "Martinez, there's nothing wrong with wanting recognition for your abilities, but that can't be your primary motivation for seeking advanced training. Specialized programs exist to meet specific operational needs, not to provide career enhancement for ambitious soldiers." She paused, considering how to frame her next point in a way that would be constructive rather than discouraging. "I'm going to suggest that you spend at least another year developing your skills and gaining experience before you apply for any specialized programs. Use that time to work on the patience and maturity that advanced training requires, and to demonstrate that your motivation is based on service rather than personal advancement." Martinez looked disappointed, but not defeated by Riley's guidance. "Sergeant, I understand what you're saying, but I'm worried that if I wait too long, I'll miss opportunities that might not be available later in my career." The concern was understandable, and Riley remembered having similar worries about timing and opportunity during her own career development. But she had learned that the military valued demonstrated performance over potential, and that rushing toward advanced training without proper preparation often led to failure rather than success. "Martinez, the opportunities will still be there if you're truly qualified for them. The military is always looking for soldiers with exceptional abilities, but they want those soldiers to have proven themselves in basic roles before taking on specialized responsibilities. Focus on excelling in your current position, and the advanced opportunities will follow naturally." As Martinez left the office, Riley made a note to monitor her development closely over the coming months. The young soldier had exceptional potential, but she would need guidance to channel her ambition in productive directions and avoid the pitfalls that could derail promising military careers. Her next counseling session was with Sergeant Chun, who entered the office with the careful, measured movements that characterized his approach to everything in military life. Riley had been working with Chun for 2 weeks, and she was beginning to understand the perfectionist tendencies that both drove his success and limited his potential. "Chun, how are you feeling about your progress in the program so far?" Riley asked, opening the conversation with a question that would allow the student to guide the discussion toward his primary concerns. Chun considered the question carefully before responding, his face showing the kind of thoughtful concentration that Riley had learned to associate with his personality. "Sergeant, I'm satisfied with my technical progress, but I'm concerned about my performance under stress. When the conditions aren't perfect or when I make an initial mistake, I seem to lose confidence and my accuracy suffers." The self-assessment was remarkably accurate, demonstrating the kind of self-awareness that Riley valued in her students. Chun understood his limitations, which was the first step toward addressing them effectively. "Chun, that's a very perceptive analysis of your performance," Riley said. "The good news is that stress management and resilience are skills that can be developed through proper training and practice. The challenge is learning to maintain your confidence even when conditions aren't ideal." She opened Chun's training folder and reviewed his scores from various exercises, noting the patterns that confirmed his self-assessment. "I can see from your performance data that your accuracy is consistently excellent when you have time to set up properly and when your first shot is successful. But your performance degrades significantly when you're under time pressure or when you have to recover from an initial miss." Chun nodded, his expression showing both agreement and frustration with his own limitations. "Sergeant, I know what's happening, but I'm having difficulty controlling my emotional response when things don't go according to plan. I start thinking about the mistake instead of focusing on the next shot." Riley recognized the problem immediately, having worked with numerous students who struggled with similar issues. The solution required a combination of technical training and psychological preparation, helping Chun develop mental routines that would maintain his focus even when circumstances weren't perfect. "Chun, I'm going to work with you on some mental preparation techniques that should help with this issue. The key is developing pre-planned responses to common problems so that you don't have to make emotional decisions when you're under pressure." As the counseling session continued, Riley found herself drawing on lessons she had learned from her own instructors and her combat experience to help Chun develop the mental resilience that would make him more effective in challenging situations. The process reminded her of why she had chosen to become an instructor rather than continuing in operational roles. The satisfaction of helping other soldiers develop their potential was more meaningful to her than any individual achievement. The final counseling session of the day was with Corporal Washington, who had demonstrated steady progress throughout the program, despite not possessing the natural talent of some of his classmates. Riley had developed particular respect for Washington's work ethic and positive attitude, qualities that often proved more valuable than raw ability in military settings. "Washington, I've been impressed with your dedication to improvement throughout this program," Riley began, wanting to acknowledge his efforts before addressing areas that needed continued development. "Your attitude and work ethic are exactly what we look for in soldiers who are committed to excellence." Washington smiled at the positive feedback, but Riley could see that he was also concerned about his performance relative to his more naturally gifted classmates. "Thank you, Sergeant. I have to admit, though, that I sometimes feel like I'm working twice as hard as everyone else just to keep up. I'm wondering if I'm really cut out for this level of training." The comment touched on something Riley had wrestled with throughout her own military career: the relationship between natural talent and dedicated effort in determining ultimate success. She had been fortunate to possess exceptional natural abilities, but she had also seen talented soldiers fail because they relied on their gifts rather than developing the discipline and work ethic that sustained long-term success. "Washington, let me tell you something about talent and effort," Riley said, her voice carrying the conviction that came from personal experience. "Natural ability might give someone an advantage in the early stages of training, but sustained success requires the kind of dedication and persistence that you've been demonstrating. In combat, I'd rather have a disciplined soldier with average skills than a gifted soldier who hasn't learned to work hard." She gestured toward Washington's training records, which showed steady improvement across all measured areas. "Your scores have improved consistently throughout the program, which tells me that you're learning and adapting effectively. That's exactly the kind of trajectory we want to see in soldiers who are committed to developing their capabilities." Washington looked encouraged by Riley's assessment, but she could see that he was still concerned about his ability to compete with more naturally talented soldiers. "Sergeant, do you think I have the potential for advanced training opportunities? Or should I focus on becoming the best possible soldier in conventional roles? The question required Riley to balance honesty about Washington's limitations with encouragement about his genuine strengths. He would probably never qualify for the most elite military programs, but he had the character and dedication that made him valuable in any role he might fill. Washington, I think you should continue developing your marksmanship skills and see where that development takes you. Don't limit yourself based on comparisons to other soldiers, but also don't pursue opportunities that aren't aligned with your strengths and interests. Focus on being the best soldier you can be and let your career develop naturally based on your performance and dedication. As Washington left the office, Riley reflected on the different challenges presented by each of her students and the various approaches required to help them reach their potential. Martinez needed guidance to channel her ambition productively. Chun needed support to develop confidence and resilience. Washington needed encouragement to continue improving without being discouraged by comparisons to others. The diversity of needs and personalities in her classes had taught Riley valuable lessons about leadership and instruction that went far beyond technical marksmanship knowledge. Effective teaching required understanding each student as an individual and adapting her approach to match their learning styles and motivational patterns. As the day ended and Riley prepared to return to her quarters, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work that made a difference in other people's lives. The young soldiers she was training would return to their units with improved capabilities that could potentially save lives in combat situations. But more importantly, they would carry with them the confidence and skills that would serve them throughout their military careers. The quiet soldier who had once been dismissed as too soft for combat had found her true calling in developing the potential of others, proving that the greatest victories were often measured not by individual achievement, but by the success of those whose lives you had touched along the way. The call came at 2 a.m, jarring Riley awake from dreams of Colorado mountains and her brother's laughter. Colonel Patricia Hayes' voice on the secure phone line was crisp despite the early hour, carrying the kind of urgency that meant lives were hanging in the balance somewhere in the world. Master Sergeant Harper, we need you wheels up in 6 hours. There's a situation developing in Somalia that requires your specific skill set. How quickly can you be ready? Riley sat up in her bed, her mind immediately shifting into the operational mode that had become second nature during her years in special operations. It had been 18 months since her last deployment, and she had assumed that her transition to instructor duties meant she was permanently out of the operational cycle. But Hayes' call suggested that her reputation and capabilities were still valued at the highest levels of military command. Ma'am, I can be ready in 4 hours. What's the nature of the mission? Hayes paused, and Riley could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. We've got a humanitarian convoy trapped in hostile territory about 40 kilometers outside Mogadishu. 23 aid workers, including 6 Americans, pinned down by an estimated 50 to 60 militia fighters. Conventional rescue is problematic due to the terrain and the political sensitivity of the situation. Riley was already moving around her quarters, mentally cataloging the equipment she would need and the preparations required for immediate deployment. Somalia meant desert conditions, long-range engagements, and the kind of complex political environment where precision and restraint were as important as tactical effectiveness. Ma'am, what's my role in the operation? You'll be working with a joint task force under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb. Your job is to provide overwatch and precision fires during the extraction operation. The terrain gives us excellent observation positions, but it's going to require someone with your level of marksmanship to be effective at the ranges involved. Riley felt a surge of recognition at Webb's name. The former sergeant who had served with her in Afghanistan had clearly continued his own career progression, and the idea of working with someone who understood her capabilities and approach was reassuring in what would undoubtedly be a challenging operation. "Understood, ma'am. I'll be ready for transport in 4 hours." As Riley packed her equipment and prepared for deployment, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been a young soldier struggling to find acceptance in a combat unit that questioned her fitness for military service. Now she was being personally selected for a high-stakes mission that would require every skill she had developed during her years of training and operational experience. The transformation hadn't been easy or straightforward. Each challenge had forced her to grow in ways she hadn't expected, pushing her beyond the comfortable boundaries of familiar roles and responsibilities. But the process had also revealed strengths and capabilities that she never would have discovered if she had remained in conventional assignments. The flight to Somalia gave Riley time to review the mission briefing and study the terrain where the operation would take place. The aid convoy had been ambushed while delivering medical supplies to a refugee camp in an area controlled by competing militia groups. The attackers had chosen their ground well, trapping the convoy in a valley where the aid workers couldn't maneuver or escape while maintaining covered positions that made direct assault extremely costly. The rescue plan was elegantly simple in concept, but would be extraordinarily difficult to execute. A small ground force would approach the convoy's position under cover of darkness and establish a defensive perimeter while the aid workers were evacuated to waiting helicopters. Riley's job was to establish an overwatch position that would allow her to engage any militia fighters who threatened the extraction operation. The challenge was the range involved. The terrain features that provided good observation positions were located between 800 and 1,200 meters from the convoy's location, distances that would test the limits of even the most sophisticated sniper systems. At those ranges, environmental factors like wind, temperature, and atmospheric pressure would have dramatic effects on bullet trajectory, requiring perfect shot placement to be effective. Riley had performed similar missions during her previous deployments, but never at such extended ranges or under such demanding conditions. The operation would require every lesson she had learned about precision marksmanship, fieldcraft, and decision-making under pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Webb met her at the staging area in Djibouti, his weathered face showing the accumulated stress of multiple combat deployments and command responsibilities. But his greeting was warm and professional, reflecting the mutual respect that had developed during their service together years earlier. "Master Sergeant Harper, good to see you again. I wish it were under better circumstances, but I'm grateful to have someone with your capabilities on this operation." Riley noted the confidence in Webb's voice and bearing, evidence of his successful transition from tactical leadership to operational command. "Sir, it's good to work with you again. What's the current situation with the convoy?" Webb gestured toward a map table where the operational details were displayed in precise military graphics. "The aid workers are still secure, but they're running low on water and medical supplies. The militia fighters have been probing their defenses, testing for weaknesses, but they haven't launched a serious assault yet. Intelligence suggests they're waiting for reinforcements before making their move." He pointed to a ridgeline that dominated the valley where the convoy was trapped. "This is your position. It's 850 meters from the convoy location, with clear lines of sight to all the approaches the militia fighters are using. You'll have one spotter and a radio operator, plus emergency medical support if needed." Riley studied the terrain features and engagement angles, mentally calculating the ballistic solutions she would need for various target locations. "Sir, what are the rules of engagement? Are we cleared to engage all armed individuals in the area, or do we need positive identification of hostile intent?" Webb's expression grew more serious as he addressed the question. "That's one of the complications of this operation. The area is controlled by multiple militia groups, some of which are nominally allied with the government forces. You're cleared to engage anyone who poses a direct threat to the convoy or the extraction operation, but you'll need to exercise judgment about target selection. The restriction meant that Riley would have to make split-second decisions about which targets represented genuine threats and which might be innocent civilians or non-hostile militia members. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes decision-making that defined modern military operations and separated experienced operators from less capable personnel. Understood, sir. I'll need current intelligence on militia, group identification, and any specific indicators that distinguish hostile from neutral forces. Webb nodded approvingly. The intelligence package is comprehensive, and your spotter has extensive experience in this region. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez worked with Special Operations Forces here for 2 years before rotating back to training duties. Riley felt a surge of recognition at the name. Maria Rodriguez had been her ballistics instructor at sniper school, one of the few female snipers who had achieved operational success in combat roles. The idea of working with Rodriguez again was both exciting and reassuring, knowing that her spotter would bring exceptional skill and experience to the mission. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, with Riley and her small team establishing their overwatch position under cover of darkness 3 hours before the planned extraction operation. The position Webb had selected was ideal for observation and fields of fire, but it was also completely exposed to return fire once her location was identified by enemy forces. Rodriguez had established a sophisticated observation post that provided excellent concealment while maintaining clear sight lines to the valley below. Her spotting scope was positioned to complement Riley's rifle scope, allowing for continuous observation of the target area and rapid target identification when the operation began. Targets of opportunity at multiple locations, Rodriguez reported. Quietly, her voice barely audible even from Riley's position just 2 feet away. I count at least 30 armed individuals in prepared positions around the convoy. They're disciplined and well-organized, not the typical militia rabble we usually see in this region. Riley settled into her shooting position, adjusting her rifle's bipod and checking her scope settings for the range and environmental conditions. The morning air was still and cool, ideal conditions for precision shooting, but she knew that would change rapidly as the sun rose and began heating the valley floor. Wind is calm, temperature 68 degrees, humidity 40%, she murmured into her radio, providing the ground force commander with environmental information that might affect the timing of the operation. Visibility is excellent, no atmospheric distortion. The extraction operation began precisely on schedule, with the ground force moving into position around the convoy while helicopters approached from multiple directions to confuse any militia fighters who might have anti-aircraft weapons. Riley watched through her scope as the tactical situation developed, identifying potential threats and calculating engagement solutions for multiple target locations. The first shots came not from Riley's position, but from militia fighters, who had detected the approaching ground force and opened fire with automatic weapons. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, shattering the pre-dawn quiet and signaling the beginning of what would become a running battle lasting nearly an hour. Multiple targets engaging the ground force from the northern ridge. Rodriguez called out, her voice steady despite the intensity of the situation developing below them. Range 900 meters, elevation angle 12 degrees, windage 0. Riley acquired the target through her scope, a militia fighter with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher who was preparing to engage one of the approaching helicopters. The range was at the extreme limit of her rifle's effective capability, requiring perfect shot placement to achieve the desired effect. She controlled her breathing, aligned her crosshairs on the target's center mass, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth, deliberate pressure that had become automatic through thousands of hours of practice. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and she immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round while Rodriguez observed the shot's impact. "Hit, target down," Rodriguez confirmed. "Outstanding shot at that range." The engagement continued for 37 minutes, with Riley engaging 14 separate targets at ranges between 400 and 1100 meters. Each shot required careful calculation of environmental factors and precise placement. To be effective, but her training and experience allowed her to maintain exceptional accuracy even under the stress of combat conditions. The most challenging shot came near the end of the operation, when a militia fighter with a heavy machine gun established a position that threatened the helicopter landing zone where aid workers were being evacuated. The target was partially concealed behind concrete barriers with only his head and shoulders visible, and the range was over 1,000 meters. "Difficult target, extreme range," Rodriguez warned. "Partial concealment, small target profile. Wind has picked up to about 5 miles per hour from the east." Riley studied the target through her scope, calculating the precise hold-off required to compensate for bullet drop and wind drift at such an extended range. The shot would require perfect execution, with no margin for error given the small target area and the critical nature of the threat. She adjusted her aim point to account for all the environmental factors, controlled her breathing to minimize movement during the trigger squeeze, and fired. The bullet traveled for nearly 2 seconds before impacting the target, and Riley could see through her scope that the militia fighter had been eliminated. "Target neutralized," Rodriguez confirmed. "Incredible shooting, Riley. That was at least 1,100 meters with a headshot." As the last of the aid workers were loaded onto evacuation helicopters and the ground force began their withdrawal, Riley felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that followed successful combat operations. The mission had been completed without any casualties among the rescue force or the aid workers, but the intensity of sustained precision shooting at extreme ranges had pushed her capabilities to their absolute limits. The helicopter ride back to the staging area gave Riley time to process what had happened during the operation and its implications for her understanding of her own abilities and potential. The success of the mission had depended entirely on her capacity to deliver precise fire at ranges that challenged the boundaries of current military technology, but more importantly, it had required the kind of calm decision-making under pressure that separated exceptional operators from merely competent ones. Lieutenant Colonel Webb debriefed her personally, his expression showing both professional satisfaction and genuine admiration for her performance. "Master Sergeant Harper, your shooting today was exceptional by any standard. 14 confirmed targets at ranges exceeding 800 meters, with several shots beyond 1,000 meters. That's the kind of performance that saves lives and changes the outcome of operations." Riley accepted the praise with the quiet professionalism that had characterized her approach to military service throughout her career. "Sir, the conditions were favorable and I had excellent support from my spotter. The success belonged to the entire team." Webb smiled at her characteristic modesty. "Harper, I've worked with a lot of snipers over the years, and I can tell you that what you accomplished today was extraordinary. Not just the technical marksmanship, but the judgment and composure you showed in making target selection decisions under pressure." As Riley prepared to return to her instructor duties at Fort Moore, she found herself reflecting on the path that had brought her from a young soldier, reading poetry in Afghan barracks, to a master sergeant capable of influencing the outcome of complex international operations through the precision application of her skills. The journey had been marked by constant growth and adaptation, each challenge revealing new capabilities and pushing her beyond previously accepted limitations. But perhaps most importantly, it had taught her that true strength lay not in individual achievement but in the willingness to use her gifts in service of others, whether that meant training young soldiers or engaging enemy targets at impossible ranges to protect innocent lives. 6 months later, Riley stood once again at the window of her office at Fort Moore, watching a new group of students struggle through their first week of advanced marksmanship training. But this time, she was watching as the newly promoted sergeant major of the Infantry Training Center, responsible not just for her own program, but for the overall development of shooting instruction across the installation. The promotion had come with recognition of her unique combination of operational excellence and instructional capability. But more importantly, it had provided her with the platform to influence military training policy at levels she never could have imagined when she first arrived at the school as a young instructor. Her phone rang, and she answered to find Major General Patricia Hayes on the line, the same voice that had awakened her months earlier for the Somalia mission, but now calling with a very different type of opportunity. "Sergeant Major Harper, I'm calling to offer you a position on the Army's Marksmanship Training Review Board. We're conducting a comprehensive assessment of precision shooting instruction across all training installations, and we need someone with your experience and credibility to help shape the future of how we develop these capabilities." Riley felt the familiar mixture of excitement and responsibility that came with new challenges and opportunities. The position would take her away from direct instruction and into the realm of policy development and institutional change, but it would also allow her to influence the training of thousands of soldiers rather than just her immediate students. "Ma'am, I'm honored by the offer. When would you need an answer?" Hayes chuckled. "Take your time, Sergeant Major, but remember that the opportunity to shape military training at this level doesn't come around very often." Your voice would carry significant weight in these discussions. As Riley ended the call and returned to watching her students, she thought about her brother Tommy and the lessons he had taught her about service and sacrifice during their hunting trips in the Colorado mountains. Tommy had always believed that true success was measured not by personal achievement, but by the positive impact you had on the world around you. The quiet soldier who had once been dismissed as too soft for combat had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in her ability to deliver precise fire at impossible ranges, but in her capacity to see potential in others and help them discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. Whether she was training individual students, leading institutional change, or engaging enemy targets in defense of innocent lives, Riley Harper had learned that the most meaningful victories were those that created opportunities for others to succeed. The desert wind outside her window carried the sound of rifle fire from the training ranges, where another generation of soldiers was learning the skills that might one day save their lives or the lives of their comrades. Each shot fired in training was an investment in future success. Each lesson learned was a step toward the kind of military excellence that her brother would have been proud to see. Riley Harper had found her calling not in individual glory, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her life's work would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by the soldiers whose potential she had helped unlock and whose capabilities would serve their nation in ways she might never know. It was exactly the kind of legacy that a quiet soldier who read poetry and understood the interconnectedness of all living things would have wanted to leave behind. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.